hands to speak, if no one prays, these very stones cry out, I am.
Shalom, hello again. Our location is a rather singular place, the Burnt House, it's called, in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. This house was of the Katros family, who lived here in 70 A.D., a priestly family, and they are up the hill from the temple site, which, as you know, was besieged by the Romans and finally captured and destroyed in 70 A.D., and 30 days after the destruction of the temple, on the 9th day of Av, it says in Josephus, they were attacked by the Romans and held out about a month, and then the Romans came in here, burnt this house, left things in this house, which we can plainly see, stone pots and so on, a Roman spear, the cups and spoons that were used and so on. And the house has been discovered and excavated. The burn marks are apparent, the history is apparent, and we came here to talk to you about archaeology. Now, to begin with, we want to talk about Zippori, which was the capital of Galilee under the Tetrarch Herod Antipas. I'm going to read from Luke 2:51. This is about Jesus and his parents returning from the Passover at the temple. It says, and he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was subject unto them. But his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and that's the point I want to make, Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, built the capital city of Galilee, Zippori, during the lifetime of Jesus. As Jesus grew up, this city was being built. And Nazareth is only 4 miles from Zippori, and it is a 1-hour donkey ride. That is the idea. They still have a donkey ride that you can take, and you can show that it's 1 hour. Jesus and his father had work there. Evidently, they were teknons in the Greek, carpenters, technicians who built things, and of course there was a lot of building going on. Probably, too, in a lively Jewish community like that, Jesus must have studied Bible and must have studied about the world around him, including the Roman and Greek customs. And, you know, some things from his learning there came into his teachings. A Greek actor, for example, was called a hypocrite, that is, someone who play acts. And later Jesus was to say, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you're just play acting at religion. This sort of thing came out of his background at Zippori, evidently. We have the Mitch Pilser with the Zippori National Park Service in an interview with Dr. Tom McCall of our ministry.
Sepphoris, Zippori in Hebrew, is located in the center of the lower Galilee, some 4 miles northwest of Nazareth. As seen from Nazareth, an ancient structure acts as a gravestone, marking the remains of this once great city. A magnificent metropolis of the Greco-Roman tradition, this prestigious governmental center was also a hub of Jewish religious activity. It had a thriving agricultural trade, boasted exquisite mosaics, and had an impressive theater. Mitch, can you describe for us where we are right now?
Well, we're about 1 kilometer east of the site of the ancient city of Zippori, which we can see on the far hillside there. And over there, and about 3 kilometers to the east, you can see the modern city of Nazareth rising on the hill.
Well, that was where Jesus was raised, in Nazareth. What associations would he have had with Zippori? Or I guess it's also known as Sepphoris.
When Jesus was growing up over there in Nazareth, it was a really small town, no more than a few hundred people. But Zippori at that time was going through its greatest period of building. It became eventually a city of tens of thousands of people. Jesus himself, we can only speculate, but when you talk about the father of Jesus, Joseph, being a carpenter, carpenter is possibly a slight mistranslation of the Greek word teknos, Okay? A teknos can really mean anything, and most likely meant maybe a building worker.
He was in construction work.
He was in construction work, and it's very likely that every morning, if there was work and construction in the big city of Zippori, all the men of Nazareth and their children who were able to work would load up their donkeys with their tools and their lunch and take the hour ride to the west and reach Zippori, where they would work in order to build the construction of the city.
There was a building boom going on, as it were, under Herod Antipas during many of the early years of Jesus. Now, in front of us, we have these large holes. Do they have some significance?
This is something there's nothing like it anywhere else in Israel. It is an underground water reservoir over 250 meters long, capable of holding over 4,000 cubic meters of water. The ancient residents of Zippori, they built aqueducts to carry water from springs near Nazareth, where it filled up this reservoir here, and it guaranteed them a permanent supply of water, which was something that was necessary in a sophisticated city like Zippori, with its bathhouses, its public fountains, and its greenery.
Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, referred to Sepphoris as the ornament of the Galilee. Few places in Israel can triumph such mastery of the mosaic floor. Numerous mosaics dating from the time of Christ have been unearthed here. A group of Israeli children apply their skills to creating mini mosaics. The children first sketch out their design in the moist plaster mixture, then place the small, colorful stones into the layout. While the ancient mosaics represent the Greco-Roman influence here, it is in the ruins of a crowded residential area that the stones attest to a thriving Jewish culture.
What we're walking on here now is probably the most ancient street that's been discovered in Zippori to this day.
Mitch, do you suppose that Joseph and Mary and Jesus might have walked on this very street in Zippori?
Well, if they visited some of the poorer residential sections, I would imagine. As you can see, this isn't exactly a wide boulevard over here. The houses on one side are very close quarters facing the houses on the other side. And inside of the entire excavations here, you can see the remains of all the stones.
Yeah, there's so many stones all around here that have been uncovered. What are these, Mitch?
Well, they're the very bottom foundations of the houses, which were most likely to have been maybe 2 or 3 stories high, very close to each other. There are over 80 houses just in this small section that we've dug up over here.
There's a pretty large population that might have lived in and around this area then.
Each house, even though it wasn't very big, they probably had at least a dozen people living in it, including on the second stories, sleeping on the roofs. So if you look at 80 houses, you're seeing over 1,000 people who might have lived right in this section here.
Let's take a walk over here and see some of the details of these houses.
For instance, the first thing that we pass over here as we enter into a courtyard separating several of the houses, obviously this is a well.
What's the history of this well?
Well, the history is interesting just in the respect that when we were excavating this last summer, we actually managed to lower somebody down to the bottom of it, and he was digging in what was the mud, where many of the women who lived around here probably dropped their earthenware vessels over 2,000 years ago. And they dropped into the water, and they weren't broken, and when we pulled them out, they were complete. We pulled out over a dozen vessels like this that looked maybe no different than the day they were dropped here 2,000 years ago.
Sepphoris was well known as a center of Jewish religious activity. In the 2nd century, the Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish court, adjudicated here. And the Mishnah, a collection of Jewish oral laws, was codified here around 200 AD. The ancient community's remains reveal additional evidence of that Jewish heritage.
What looks like a bathtub is in fact an ancient ritual Jewish bath, a mikveh.
Well, that would indicate that there were Jewish people that lived here.
Priests who worked in the temple in Jerusalem but lived here in Zippori.
So the priests didn't just live in Jerusalem, they lived in outlying cities like Zippori also.
It's written in the sources in the Mishnah that one of the priestly families, the Hodiah family, they lived here in Zippori, and what we see here is the evidence, is archaeological evidence connecting them, because nobody else would have a use of over 40 mikvahs in this small residential quarter, okay? As in fact, you can see there's a wall separating the two houses. We have one mikvah here, and we have one mikvah right here in the neighboring house.
Well, I think I'd like to step down here and see what it's like to be in a mikveh.
Well, if you'd be going down into this mikveh a few thousand years ago, you'd already be mostly underwater because the level of the water went all the way up to the top.
Be up to my chest about.
And the plaster you're seeing here is the original plaster that remains from 2,000 years ago.
And the priest would go below the waters.
He would go below the water. He'd have to completely immerse himself 3 times, and that way he would be pure again in order to conduct services.
Tom and Mitch move on to the pinnacle of fine arts in Sepphoris, the remains of its once magnificent theater.
We're now following the paths of thousands of ancient residents of Zippori for over 250 years as we go through the main entrance of the theater of Zippori.
There's a marvelous view of the valley down below.
Well, unfortunately for the ancient residents of Zippori, the view was blocked for them by the wall of the back of the theater that we see in front of us over here, and they were only able to see the back of the stage.
How many people could sit in the theater?
The capacity crowd here was about 4,500 people, which is quite something. You consider that Zippori itself only had about 30,000 residents at the time that it was built.
And would they just sit where we can see the steps, or was it larger than that?
Well, the steps you're only looking at here are the lower mezzanine, okay? In fact, right where I'm standing here and above me would be a whole other level of the theater, including stone and wooden seats.
And how old is this theater? When was it built?
There's a lot of speculation that, in fact, there was a much older culture of theater here in Zippori.
Even at the time of Jesus, which would have been 60 or so years before the building here.
We try to wonder why they would build such a grand theater in a place unless there was a big demand for the theater, okay? It must have meant that there must have been some kind of smaller structure that accommodated the theater. And in fact, even from what we know about Jesus himself, we can assume that there was a theater in Zippori.
What are some of the things that the Gospels bring out that might suggest that Jesus had been exposed to this kind of culture?
Okay, for one, he uses lots of Greek words, okay? Greek words, which he would have no way to pick them up in a little town of Nazareth. He would have to come to a city where there was a sizable Greek population, and he even uses words that are connected to the theater, like hypocrite. Hypocrite was a term that meant actor mostly, some other meanings. Also, we can take into account when we see even like his staging, the way that he set up the Sermon on the Mount, okay? It was done in the whole style of a theater.
Mitch's reference to staging infers that just as an actor would deliver his lines from this stage to the audience above, Jesus, taking a page from the Sepphoris theater, most likely delivered his Sermon on the Mount from below the hillside at the Mount of Beatitudes. Previous programs have demonstrated how the sound resonates effortlessly up the hillside.
Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
אשרי השואפים בכל ליבם לעשות את הטוב והישר כי אלוהים ימלא את שאיפתם.
Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled.
From this example, the Sermon Below the Mount might have been a more appropriate title for Christ's magnificent treatise on godly living. Well, that's the inspiring Mount of Beatitudes. Tom, Sepphoris is not mentioned in the Bible, but there's a lot to be learned there. Huh?
Well, that's the amazing thing. Everybody understands that Jesus and his disciples were steeped in the Old Testament and in the Jewish culture of the day in Israel. What is less realized is that they were also exposed at the same time to this Greco-Roman culture, as represented in Sepphoris, which was only 4 miles from Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. And that was the capital that Herod Antipas chose, and he built it up to be a jewel of the Galilee, and it was really that kind of a city. Well, they had been exposed to all of this culture of the theater and of the banks and of the kings, so that it was readily understandable that the writers of the New Testament, the Gospels, would have understood these things just as they understood the Old Testament and Jewish traditions.
Mm-hmm. When we return, we'll speak with Seymour Gitton, an archaeologist who is working at the excavations at Ekron, where there is another case of the stones crying out.
Come with Zola Levitt and see for yourself the land of the covenant.
I do not see how it could have been any better with what was chosen for us to do, as well as who guided us, who spoke with us, the other people on the trip. It was wonderful.
Tour the Holy Land with Zola Levitt. Call or write for more information.
Well, come along on our tour and you'll see some of these archaeological digs. We stopped at some of the most famous ones, Megiddo and Masada, Bat Shan. You know, Dr. Seymour Gittin, the director of the Albright Institute, and Trudy Dotan of Hebrew University are both studying Ekron and the Philistines. Now, Ekron was one of the 5 Philistine cities, and it's one of the ones where they kept the Ark of the Covenant, but they sure were sorry.
Oh, it caused plagues to fall upon them. They thought it was going to make them stronger, but they got plagues, and they sent it back as quick as they could to the Israelites with gifts. But that's the interesting thing about the Philistines. They settled on the coastlands of the land of Israel, and the Jewish people settled in the central highlands of Judea and Samaria. And they were both exposed to each other in their cultures. They were also exposed to the Egyptians, to the Assyrians, to the Babylonians. But the Philistines were assimilated and disappeared. And they reacted differently from the Jewish people who didn't disappear. They're still with us.
Yes. So they went off with the Assyrians and were lost to history.
Lost to history. We asked Dr. Giddens, what happened to the Philistines?
It's a fascinating story because as we excavate layer by layer by layer, we see after 100 or 200 years less of the ethnic markers that would indicate an Aegean origin. So by the year, let's say 1000 BCE, when we know from the biblical story and from other sources, there was a great buildup of power inland, and we call that the United Monarchy. We talk about the period of Saul and David and Solomon. The Philistines lost their geopolitical and economic importance, and we see that recorded in the archaeological record. For instance, at Ekron, this huge site, one of the largest sites in the biblical period, somewhere about 1000 BCE, much of the city is destroyed. And what population is left recedes to a small 10-acre area. The city had been at least 50 acres in size before that. And for about 250 years, the city remained quite small and unimportant.
The book of Judges states, "And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they slew the Canaanites that inhabited Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. Also Judah took Ekron with the coast thereof." Additionally, 1 Samuel declares, "And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines to the gates of Ekron." Although uncertain as to which passage describes the destruction seen in the archaeological finds of Ekron, the Bible plainly accounts for the intermittent Israelite dominion over the Philistines. The Bible also mentions a subsequent invasion of Judah and Israel by a force from the east. The book of 2 Kings asserts, "Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them." This occurred in the 8th century BC. Surprisingly, archaeology shows, the domination of Judah was Ekron's delight.
And the Philistine states, which were so productive, they gave a certain leeway. They gave them a certain sense of independence, and they made them vassal states, which means they more or less controlled their own territory. Now, Ekron they chose as the center for the largest olive oil production anywhere indicated or found to date in the ancient Near East.
Olive oil production.
That's right. In the 7th century city. This was a city that was suddenly built up in the Assyrian period. And Ekron went from a small, unimportant city in this medium period that I talked about before, suddenly expanded to about 85 acres. And we have thus far, in excavating about only 4% of the site, and of course surveying all of the top remains, found 115 olive oil installations.
It is believed the Philistines produced some 290,000 gallons of olive oil a year, mostly for export. However, like the oil being pressed from the olives, Philistine cultural life was being squeezed out as the Aegean immigrants assimilated the traditions of those around them. Seymour and his team uncovered artifacts which communicate this influence. This four-horned incense altar was one of them.
Now, I'm sure you want to know what a four-horned incense altar, which is typical of ancient Israelite religion that we know about from the Bible and we know about from archaeological excavations at Israelite sites, what this is doing at Ekron. It's not found in any other Philistine city in the period. Our theory is that the Philistines survived so long, from about 1200 to 600 BCE, that's about 600 years, because they were very flexible. Whenever a nation confronted them or conquered them, they adapted something of that culture and they were flexible enough to survive. By the time we come to the great growth period, the zenith of Ekron in the 7th century, it's very hard to find anything left over from their ancestors that have an Aegean motif or an Aegean theme about them.
Egyptian culture was also represented in Ekron's ruins. This magnificent golden cobra, called a uraeus, once adorned the crown of an Egyptian pharaoh. Also unearthed was what Sy believes to be their most important find, a stone inscription from Ekron's temple complex.
And what it says, very briefly, is that this is a beit, a house or a temple, perhaps a shrine, built, bana, by Achish, whom we identify with Ikausu of the Neo-Assyrian texts, who is the son of Padi, who is the son of so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, all of these wonderful names. And then we come across the word Sar, which is the word for king or ruler of Ekron. And this temple was built to a goddess, his goddess, the goddess of Achish or Ikausu, and may there be blessing and long life, etc. Now, why is this inscription so important? Actually, it's the first time an inscription has been found in place, in situ, on an excavation in which the date is not in question. This was found in the Neo-Babylonian destruction of 603 BCE, the destruction caused by the king Nebuchadnezzar. So we have an inscription which is like a signpost. It says, after 13 years of excavation, absolutely, you were excavating Ekron.
Sy, what happened to the Philistines that had this civilization?
In the 7th century, when they had this huge industrial complex, this great city, when they reached the zenith of its growth, all of these factors from other countries impacted so heavily that by the time the Babylonians destroyed the city and physically removed the inhabitants and took them eastward into Babylon, that they no longer had any core culture left to maintain themselves in exile.
So they more or less disappeared from the face of history.
Well, we don't have any evidence archaeologically or in terms of text that is significant that would indicate that they really continue. It's more or less a people that disappeared, like perhaps the ancient Ammonites or the Moabites or the Edomites, lost in the pages of history.
You know, Scripture talks about what happened to this land along the coast. Zephaniah 2:7, and the coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They shall feed thereupon. In the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening, for the Lord their God shall visit them and turn away their captivity. God gave Ashkelon, a city just north of Gaza, to the Jewish people. And now in Gaza, people who claim they are descended from the Philistines are in the land.
And here it is, the fulfillment of, we're already seeing of Zephaniah's prophecy that the Jewish people have returned to the land. They're living on the coast where the Philistines used to live. And then there's the Arabs who are living there. They're calling themselves Palestinians, and some of them actually claim to be descendants of the Philistines. But there's no way that could be. As the scholars have found out, the Philistines have disappeared from the face of the earth. They disappeared in Assyria when they were carried off into captivity.
They don't have any descendants.
And no descendants left. Yeah. And so the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael, not of the Philistines. So
and furthermore, the Philistines were not even Middle Eastern people.
Not indigenously. That is an amazing thing. They found out that they came from Greece.
Yes.
The Philistines were Grecians who migrated from the Aegean Sea area and settled on the coast of Israel and were the sea peoples. They had a maritime occupation.
Like the Phoenicians, they tended to ship and fish. And so
exactly. And so there's no connection between modern-day Palestinian Arabs and the ancient Palestinians who've disappeared, or Philistines who've disappeared from the face of the earth.
Yes. Tom, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. This kind of learning that we get from these digs, and you and I are learning as well as the audience.
It's good to be with you again, Zola.
You're competent to discuss it. Thanks. And Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.